So welcome. Thank you all for joining us here this evening. My name is Nikki Tuckwell. I am with the Education and Outreach team at APRA AMCOS, and I am joined on the call this evening by my colleagues Caroline and Al, and of course by Dan Pash from Accessible Arts. We would like to begin this evening with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land. I'm going to acknowledge the owners of the land I'm joining you from, and that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It was an absolutely stunning day on Gadigal land. I got to walk past the harbour and just really take it in and take a moment to be so grateful for the place that I am living on and working on. And of course, our First Nations people share their traditions via song and via storytelling. So it means a lot to us here in APRA AMCOS and in the musical community to take that acknowledgement. So yes, acknowledging their elders past and present. And we'd like to extend that acknowledgement to any First Nations callers who may be here this evening, and of course to our cousins in Aotearoa who may be joining us as well. That is basically the start of the webinar, but what I should also mention is the Q&A facility. So you'll notice that tonight the chat feature is switched off, but you do have a Q&A function. So it's either going to be at the bottom of your Zoom screen or the top. Some people have different setups. If you want to ask questions throughout tonight's presentation, tonight's webinar, please pop them into that Q&A text. Caroline and Al will be there in the background. If your question happens to be about APRA AMCOS, they will be able to help you out. But we have time with Dan at the end to answer a lot of questions live. So anything you're curious about, anything that doesn't quite make sense to you or that you've just always wanted to know, that's the place to pop those questions in. The recording from this evening is going to be made available. We'll send you all a link in about a week or so after this evening. We'll make it available just for a limited time. It will have about 3 months, but as the holidays are coming up, that should give you plenty of time to dive in and rewatch this one. So let's do it. Let's dive in. I would like to formally introduce Dan Pash, who is the project manager at Accessible Arts, here with us. Now, Dan is an active musician himself, a talented guitarist and clarinet player who was championed as Australia's biggest export by Rolling Stone. He's performed at festivals including Splendour in the Grass and Big Day Out, has toured with major international acts such as Blonde Redhead and Dinosaur Jr., and has had his music longlisted for the Australian Music Prize and spotlighted as Triple J's feature album. Dan somehow managed to fit in between all of that, gaining a Bachelor in Classical Music Performance and in Orchestral Studies, plus completed a PhD in 2020. Dan is a passionate advocate for creating greater opportunities for musicians who identify as deaf or disabled, which is what brings him here to speak with us tonight. So thank you, Dan. Let's dive in. And really, let's start with you. Please tell us a little bit more about yourself, your role with Accessible Arts, and your journey as a musician.
Well, thank you for a wonderful introduction there, Nikki. Thank you to APRA AMCOS for having me along, and to everyone who's turned up today. It's a real pleasure and privilege to have the opportunity to be here and speak to you all. Before I dive into my answer to that question, I just want to join Nikki in acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today, which is Gadigal Wangal land. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians, elders past, present, and still to come, and join Nikki in extending those respects to any First Nations people here with us today. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I would add that it's particularly important to think about our First Nations people when we're discussing issues of access and inclusion, because we know that they are, you might say, overrepresented in the community of people with disability in this country. As a matter of fact, we know that about 45% of First Nations people 15 years and older have disability or a long-term health condition. And that's in comparison to only about 19% of the rest of the population. So it's a very, very significant portion of the community of people with disability who are First Nations. And that's something that needs to be acknowledged straight off the bat when we're talking about the sorts of barriers that people with disability face in the arts and in music. It's also just a sort of glimpse into a point that may or may not come up throughout this discussion around the intersectional nature of the community of people with disability. It's a very diverse, very intersectional community. So no doubt that will come up. We'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit later as well. But for myself, who am I? I'm Dan. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a small d deaf musician, songwriter, academic, and educator. Um, I suffer from sensory neural hearing loss. So that's basically just a genetic predisposition to gradually lose my hearing over time. I began losing my hearing pretty much since I was born. And by the time I was in my 20s, when I had dreams of being an orchestral player, my hearing loss had already got to the point where that dream was sort of nipped in the bud straight away, because there were already things at that age in the high frequencies that I was not able to hear, certain overtones of certain instruments and so on. So at that point, I pivoted to rock music and was in a band that put out a couple of records around the turn of the 2010s and did a whole raft of touring. Eventually, the hearing got so bad that that touring lifestyle was no longer really sustainable. And at that point, I went back to my other great love, which is philosophy. So I have a PhD in philosophy from Sydney Uni, specializing in philosophy of art. And I've gradually become more and more involved in accessible arts in the last 2 or 3 years, initially as a consultant on a co-design process for a program, a songwriting program for musicians who are deaf or disabled. And then gradually as a project manager on a bunch of music-related programs. So I've had the privilege of being involved with accessible arts on a bunch of really exciting initiatives lately that I probably don't have time to get into now, but there's the songwriting program for people, for musicians who are deaf or disabled. There was an accessible venues initiative, a tiered accreditation system for venues and festivals based on their level of accessibility, which was fantastic. We had venues like Sydney Opera House and Laneway Festival, through to smaller venues like Knox Street Bar and Crowbar, who were involved in that program. So it was really wonderful. And I suppose the great thing about accessible arts is that you sort of get to work on both sides of the stage, as it were, helping both organizations, events, festivals, and people with the chance to employ musicians with disability, and with musicians with disability themselves, helping to advance their career paths in various ways. So that's me and accessible arts.
I love Knox Street Bar. Sorry, I noticed that little shout out there. That's a great little spot. Awesome. So in your role there at Accessible Arts, can you tell us a bit more about its overarching role within the music industry?
Absolutely. So for those who might not be familiar with accessible arts, we are the peak arts and disability body for New South Wales, which basically means we're an organisation that represents a whole bunch of smaller organisations. And it's primarily our aim and our remit to make sure that artists, arts workers, and audiences with disability have full access and participation in the incredibly diverse arts sector here in New South Wales. And we do that through a range of different things. We offer specialized training programs, again, on both sides of the stage and across all art forms. So we have specific masterclasses for screen, music, arts, things like how to organize accessible events, accessible marketing and social media, down to the absolute basics like disability confidence training, which is sort of our entry level course for people who want to learn more about how to get a conversation started with people with disability. So there's the training, there are public events and forums and roundtables on various issues of the moment. And I'll put in a plug for a few of those later on that are coming up. And there's also a range of funding initiatives that we have, things like mentorships, apprenticeships, residencies, programs around artists wanting to learn more about how to not just create, but also release the results of their creativity out into the world. So all sorts of things, really. We many different sort of arms of our empire. And so yeah, it's a very important role that we perform. And you can learn more about that in ways that I'll tell you later.
Okay, perfect. And I should say too, I've done some of the accessible arts workshops, some that were actually for people with disabilities. So I enrolled in the wrong thing, and then but many of the workshops are open to everyone. So I do encourage people to just enroll and learn a whole bunch of new skills, because you can apply them all across the board. They're very helpful. Which really, I guess, brings me to, speaking of using the skills across the board, do you have a personal story, or can you share an example that illustrates the impact of accessibility in the arts?
Absolutely, yeah. I think for me, the thing that springs to mind immediately is an instance with the band that I played in many years ago. We were performing at Splendor in the Grass Festival for the second time, and unbeknownst to us, to me, the organizers had arranged for our performance to have a Perspex sound baffle, which is, for those of you who might not know the name of it, but anyone who's gone to festivals specifically to see sort of bigger bands, it's sort of a clear plastic barrier that goes in between the drum kit and the front of the stage, so that people on the stage are shielded somewhat from noise exposure of the drums. Um, it was a huge deal for us because it's absolutely not the type of thing that we could have afforded on our own. But one of the main things that came through was the fact that it was not something that we asked for. It was an example of that organization really getting on the front foot as far as finding out about the access needs and access requirements of a band that they booked to play. And that's something that we really advocate for in any kind of training around access and inclusion in music, whether you're a small club or a larger venue or festival, or anyone employing musicians with disability, to really get on the front foot and ask about what's required, and even deliver it without asking. That's the dream. That's what we really dream of, that it just becomes normal for our access requirements to be met. And in that instance, I think it's a good example because not only it benefited me personally, it meant that it lessened my physical discomfort, which accompanied my style of hearing loss when exposed to very loud volumes. But it led to a better performance for the people on stage. I was much more comfortable. It was a better show, and hopefully the people in the audience, picked up on that and had a better time. So that's one example.
That makes perfect sense. And we all learned something today, a baffle. There you go. Maybe some people knew that. I just called it the clear plastic divider, the barrier. Speaking of barriers, let's move on to barriers and solutions to access and inclusion. So what are some of the barriers that disabled songwriters and composers will commonly face when they're trying to participate in music spaces?
It's a great question to begin with, and it's a really big question. So one of the things that I try to think about when tackling this question and speaking about this question in conversation or in a training context or what have you, what I like to do is sort of take a step back and think, well, if we're figuring out how to tackle these barriers, it's helpful, I think, to start thinking about where they come from. And when we think about where the barriers that people face come from in this instance, there are a couple of different lenses that we can view that through, a couple of different models that have been used over the years to help us get a grip on what these barriers are and where they come from. One of those models is the medical model of disability. Um, it's been around for a very long time, and it's still prevalent in many areas. The medical model basically says that it's the person with disability who is the problem. So in my instance, the barrier to my full participation in, let's say, the music industry is my deafness. The result of thinking about things in that way is that the onus is then entirely upon the person with disability
Mm.
to fix, adjust, get around that issue. Mostly, certainly in my experience, that involved something more like just pretending or faking that I was okay. But when you combine that pressure to get around these barriers entirely on your own with an industry like the music industry, which is very, very competitive, it often involves really long hours for really low pay. The results of that model can be very, very detrimental. They can be exhausting at a physical level, they can be isolating at an emotional level, and really just lead to a bad time all around. Thankfully, there is a different model that we have open to us. It's a model that we owe to the first wave of disability rights activists in the UK in the 1970s, and it's called the social model of disability. The social model says rather than the person with disability being the problem, rather than the disability being the barrier, instead, the barrier is what happens when a person with disability interacts with a social or built environment that is not made with them in mind. So in this case, let's say, as a deaf person, I'm in a movie theater or a lecture hall, a movie theater that's not offering captions, or a lecture hall where the hearing aid loop is broken, and these types of things. The barrier in this sense is not my deafness. It's what happens when someone with deafness enters that environment which has not been made with them in mind. It's a breakdown in the responsibility that we all have as members of society and contributors to the social and built environment, to take it upon ourselves to change that environment in such a way that it becomes more accessible. So the great thing about this different way of looking at things is that the onus is no longer on the individual with disability to change. It's actually up to all of us. We all have control over the ways in which we interact with people with disability, and we all, as members of organizations or employers, have some degree of control over the types of environment that we're offering to people. So one of the good things is that this also allows us to sort of think very clearly about two different types of barriers that people face. I've talked a little bit about physical barriers. When we think of barriers, most people are going to immediately think of that. They'll think of, are there wheelchair ramps? Are there accessible bathrooms and so on? And those things are very important. I've also talked a little bit about other physical things like, the hearing environment, access services, whether or not they're functioning or whether they're offered at all. We'll talk a little bit later probably about some of the sensory aspects of the environment that can be barriers for some people. But there's also another type of barrier that we're responsible for, and that is the one that we carry with us in our attitudes and the way we interact with people. So an example that I can give of one of these barriers, a dear friend of mine, Dan Pash, who plays in a wonderful Sydney synth pop band called Infinite Skies, was telling me about an incident where she was performing at a festival. She was entering the festival, going through the gate, speaking with security staff. After a very short conversation, security staff said, "You can't come in, you're too drunk." And she hadn't had anything to drink whatsoever. It was due to the fact that Anne is autistic, that she was having a little bit of trouble understanding what was being discussed in that instance. Medical model says the problem is Anne's autism. The social model says no, it's actually the problem stemming from the attitudes and unconscious, hopefully unconscious biases that the security staff is perpetrating there. So again, barriers aren't just physical, they're also internal. And that thinking about things in terms of the social model really puts the onus back on us to make sure that we are conscious of, for example, unconscious biases and things like ableist assumptions about what is normal behavior for someone entering a festival or what is normal behavior for a musician on stage. And those are all things that we need to bear in mind if we're going to tackle these barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right, though. I think the physical, it's definitely something that we consider a lot more. And obviously, when we're putting on all our events, it's a top of mind sort of thing. But how, sorry, excuse me.
That's all right.
But on that topic, really, how can non-disabled musicians help advocate for more inclusive venues and events and things like that?
That's a great question. And I think there are a couple of different ways that they can go about doing this. There's, let's say it's an instance where you're performing at a given venue. You can ask them to make provisions for access. And for example, you can ask questions like, you don't, in fact, before you even ask questions, you can do things like go to the venue's website. You can check, do they have an accessibility page on their website? Is it easy to get to, or is it hidden 17 clicks from the homepage at the bottom of the Q&As? Is there up-to-date, accurate information around access that's presented in an accessible way? And by that, I mean, is it presented in plain language? Are there helpful visual aids being used? You can ask all those sorts of questions. Are there accessible toilets in the venue? If not, what are the nearest accessible toilets? And are the venue aware of them? Are the staff able to direct people um, to those accessible bathrooms? Does the venue offer a companion card program? Does it have accessible seating? A range of different seating options available? Does it have strobe lighting and those sorts of things? These are things you can ask about um, if they're important to you. Obviously, if you're not disabled yourself, it still can be very, very important for the audience who are potentially going to come along and see you play. So these are things that you can ask about for a venue. If they don't have these things, you can use the power of feedback. Most venues will have contact information where you can leave feedback. A lot of times after specific events, definitely for larger festivals and so on. If you bought a ticket, chances are somebody's going to send you a questionnaire. People are always trying to get free, information around feedback. And those are a great opportunity to say, yeah, it was a fun festival, but it turns out, my friend in a wheelchair was looking at the website beforehand and decided, you know what, it just wasn't going to be worth accompanying me to this festival. So how about next year you think about making such and such changes? The main thing, if you're interacting one-on-one with a venue, would be being prepared to have a conversation around access. And again, there's a few different ways that we can approach that topic. There's just the straight up moral case. It's just the right thing to do, um, which is absolutely true. But you might not want to lead with that case. You might want to lead with the business case, which is that there are 5.5 million people in this country living with disability. That's over 21% of the population. And that is a huge, huge potential audience whose needs often go completely ignored and unmet. So the business case means making your venue more accessible in order to attract the potentially huge number of people with disability who will frequent your business. And I can guarantee you that it might not happen overnight, but word travels very, very fast in the disabled community. And if there are venues that are really making the effort, I know off the top of my head a bunch that I would recommend who are really, really great. And I tell everybody I know about these venues constantly. And once word gets around, and the community embraces you, it's a really, really wonderful thing. So there is that business case to be made as well. There's also the artistic case, which blends into the moral case, which is that the more access and inclusion we offer in the music industry, the more people contribute to the musical conversation, the greater diversity we achieve, and that's just a good thing to aim at in general. You can highlight, perform at, and promote venues that are doing a good job. You can, a lot of people obviously make posts on the day of a show, day after a show. There'll be a bunch of photos. We had a great time. and good job to X venue for providing such and such a service, or for making, the night a bit better for audiences with disability. And the last thing I would say is, do it yourself. You can organize your own event at any type of space that you want to. You can hire out spaces. You can do things to make them more accessible. You can provide information around access, and show venues who aren't interested in catering to these requirements what they're missing out on.
Absolutely. And of course, if you're going to do your own event, reach out to Events at One Music, and they will set you up with a license so that all the musicians get paid as well, because that's pretty key. That's close to our heart too. So let's move beyond sort of the physical barriers that we've been talking about and look at accessible communication formats. You mentioned plain language before, audio descriptions and Auslan, and my apologies, I should have said during the housekeeping, there are captions available for tonight. They are ready to go, so please switch those on if that is something that will help you this evening. But of course, these types of plain language and audio description, they can make a really big difference. So how can songwriters incorporate these into their own practice and their collaborations?
Great question. And I should say, yeah, the captions, I'm using the captions right now, and they're working very well. So, so good job on that. And thank you also, before I spoke at this event, for asking me what my access requirements are. I want to mention that to the audience, that's a wonderful thing that APRA is always on top of, in my experience. So that's fantastic. So this question, again, there's a couple of different ways we can think about it. We can think about it in terms of your practice as a performer, and we can think about it in terms of your sort of individual creative practice. So when performing, you want to provide an access statement, something like that, hopefully, around what the access will be like at a given show. So just a heads up on your social media about, here's what will happen tonight. If you're a wheelchair user, here's what you want to do. Here's a link to the website. If the venue itself has information they can check out. Providing that sort of access statement, letting people know ahead of time what to expect. Information, sorry, that's my 2-year-old squealing in the background. Information is the best weapon we have in terms of access.
We can't hear. It's fine.
Providing clear, up-to-date information in an accessible format is the best way to take the onus, workload off people with disability who are thinking about attending a venue. The other, obviously, for artists at the top end of the sort of food chain, hiring an Auslan interpreter for shows is an option. If you're not Taylor Swift or Coldplay, maybe you probably can't afford it. But there are local bands who do that, and it is a wonderful, wonderful aspect of their show. I want to put in a shout out for a wonderful WA band called Altar Boy, who they have sort of a rotating cast, but they are primarily deaf and hard of hearing musicians, and Auslan interpretation is part and parcel of their show. It's organized as part of the performance from the very get-go. So there are wonderful ways to incorporate those sorts of things into your performances. If Auslan interpreting is too expensive, there are DIY captions that you can set up using just a laptop and a TV. You can create a slideshow with your set list, putting the lyrics on each slide. You can add pictures as well and project them onto a TV or onto the back wall of the venue. Seen that done many, many times. And it's a wonderful, wonderful way to get people who are deaf or hard of hearing involved and allowing them to feel like they're, really getting the most out of the show, because lyrics are really, really important. Not for some people, I guess, but for people they really are. So there's always audio, including captions and audio descriptions for film clips and things like that. When we're talking about our own creative process, having mentioned just the band Altar Boy before, there's the topic called aesthetics of access, which is to do with incorporating access into the artwork itself. So not just preparing a song, preparing a set list, playing them, and then think, right, how are we going to tack access onto the top of it? It's more, what can we do from the ground up to really embed access into the performance from the beginning? And so that's something that you can pay attention to, blending access seamlessly into both the creative process and the performance process. Um, so there's a couple of ways.
Yeah, definitely. And look, personally, I do love watching the Auslan interpreter when they love the band and they get really into it. They're kind of doing the emotion along with the signing. It's fantastic. Also with comedians seem to I don't know, use extra swearing, I think, when they have Auslan, but that's beside the point. So look, we talked about physical barriers, communication barriers. What about sensory access? That gets overlooked quite a lot. So what should musicians consider when they're planning performances or workshops to being more inclusive of neurodiverse audiences?
There are a whole bunch of things to consider. I'll name as many as I can in quick succession. Very high on the list would be providing a chill out space at a given show. Thankfully, so many venues and events do this now, not just music events, but artistic events in general, which is fantastic to see. It basically involves providing a quiet space with comfortable seating, ideally soft lighting. If the budget's there, you can add things like fidget spinners, headphones, anything you can do for people who just need to step out of a situation where there's sort of a sensory overload happening, get away from the light, get away from the noise, get away from smells that can be overpowering, and really just get centered again. So providing a chill out space is very high on the list. It doesn't have to be a luxurious five-star suite with, beanbags and Enya playing in the corner. It should be very comfortable, but there are lots and lots of different ways to provide that in settings where you wouldn't ordinarily think would provide that sort of service. Avoid strobe lighting. Just lighting is a big one, but the golden rule I would say is avoid strobe lighting because that's just a very, very potentially harmful, overpowering sensory presence. Avoiding extreme temperatures. So we've all been in venues where, if you're the first to arrive, the air conditioner's been on all day and it is like sub-zero. Walking into the venue, it can be a real shock. And for people with disability, that can be a real deal breaker. So likewise, avoiding extreme heat. So yeah, avoiding strong fragrances. This is something that perhaps some people don't think about. It's happening more in places like workspaces and so on. But yeah, strong fragrances can really be unpleasant for a lot of people with sensory disability. Uh, Sensory-friendly food options are also becoming more and more prevalent. There are things called quiet dinners that are offered at a lot of venues, especially in the UK these days, and more venues in Australia and certain areas are providing them as well. It's basically just dinner in a much more quiet setting than we're used to, where it seems like every restaurant these days is like determined to make more noise than the one next door. The acoustics are terrible. You're in a cement box, the music is pumping, everyone's screaming into each other's ears, and everything's just bouncing off the walls, and it's just mayhem. So yeah, sensory-friendly food options are really great to offer as well. Provide earplugs. Lots and lots of venues thankfully do this now, but that's a really surprising piece of just like low-hanging fruit that lots of venues don't do. Providing earplugs is just good for everyone, really. As someone who's experienced massive hearing damage, noise exposure isn't the only culprit of it, but it definitely didn't help. So earplugs are a big one. Plenty of other sort of fairly obvious ones like allowing assistance animals, making sure they're provided for, making sure that there's not just a water bowl, but also a space near the venue where they can be toileted without having to walk miles. Allowing early entry and pass outs is a big one. And I would say that's probably less common these days, even in some
Yeah.
places that are doing a great job accessibility wise. It's often a problem for larger venues because it's hard to um, keep track of buildings that have lots and lots of entries and exits and so on. But pass outs are a really big thing for people with disability. They need to step out and take a breather if they need to arrive early, um, if they need to, if there's no accessible toilet in the building and they need to go out and use a different one and come back in, it just avoids a whole lot of dramas. And again, for people who are overwhelmed in a sensory sense. That's very useful for them as well. Um, and again, just to get back to the number one thing, information above all about all of these things,
Mm.
whether these are going to be provided at a given performance or event. It can be really, really stressful as an audience member with disability, not knowing how many of these things are going to be provided ahead of time. It's always a risk, and it makes things so much more pleasant and relaxing if um, all of these things are, even if they're not available, to have that listed clearly in a place that's easy to find on the website is a real plus.
That's huge. That list is much, much longer than I was thinking of. That's amazing. I can see my colleagues are taking notes here, so that's fantastic. We might do a bit of an article, I think, and kind of compile this all together, pop it on the website. But look, we promised everyone that we'd talk about accessible social media and marketing and that sort of thing. So first of all, like, why is accessible social media so crucial for artists?
Well, I mean, I would say it's crucial for artists these days because it's the main form of communication that we have with a potential audience. Um, there are bands that survive without it, but it's very, very difficult, especially for bands starting out, to communicate and, in particular, to network with other like-minded artists and bands. I would say it's especially important for artists and audience with disability because it makes us part of that conversation. Um, it is, you know, we spend just as much time interacting with art, giving our time to art. In fact, there's a whole bunch of statistical evidence to suggest that people with disability, on average, donate more of their time and more of their money to the arts than people without disability, despite the fact that we face so many barriers and are likely to have less time and money to give in the first place. So that includes social media, always scrolling, and I can't tell you um, how pleasant it is these days if you're scrolling to note that a video that doesn't have captions is kind of becoming the outlier compared to a
Mhm.
bunch of videos that do have captions these days. So that's just another reason to get on board. Social media is just, as much as we hate it, as much as it's colonizing our attention and potentially ruining it for other things, um, it's a conversation, and people with disability want to feel part of that conversation. And um, it's one really easy way to do it. And again, to get back to the business case, there are 5 million of us, 5.5 million of us out there, and we're looking. So make it easy for us to find you and easier to um, interact with what you're putting out.
Well, so let's break it down. Like, you've just mentioned captions and Auslan. And yes, you're right. Inevitably now I do notice most videos have the captions, but what are some of the key accessibility features that people should be using on their social media?
So yeah, I would say if you're creating videos yourself, absolutely add captions. It's so easy to do. There's so many different ways that you can do it. If you can, add Auslan as well for certain announcements, certain big announcements, especially if you're a larger organization or event. Your big festival, the social media promo videos should really have Auslan interpreters as part of the video. Um, For the captions and for any text that you're sharing, sans serif fonts are the way to go. Much easier to read for people with low vision, people who are blind. Not being obscure, people who are blind and using screen readers. So yeah, captions are sans serif, not obscured by headers and things like that. That can be annoying as well. Like there are so many, like the automated captions are on and they're hidden behind an ad in the top corner or whatever. That can be really annoying. Using hashtags, um, using camel case in all of your hashtags is a really big thing. So camel case means for any hashtag containing 2 words, the first letter of each word is capitalized. So capital C-A-M-E-L, capital C-A-S-E, just makes it so much easier for a whole range of people to read and understand it. Using alt text and image descriptions. So those are quite similar, but most people I think would be aware of what these are and how easy they are to add to, say, an app like Instagram. If you're making a post, really easy to add alt text. It's basically just a description of what's happening in the picture, but it's something that becomes embedded into the picture such that people with low vision or people who are blind and using a screen reader, the screen reader will automatically pick up that text. So that's alt text. Image descriptions are sort of the same thing, but they are separate. They happen in the below the caption for the actual post and below the hashtags. And that's just the words image description and then a simple description about what's happening in the photo. Emoji use is a bit of a tricky one. I would say that we do tend to suggest not using too many emojis. I realize that we don't want, I know, yeah, we don't want to spoil people's fun. There is an art to using the emoji. So that's fine, but we just do want to stress that emojis shouldn't ever replace text. And ideally you would keep them simple. And definitely don't use more than 3 or 4 in a row at a time. Things like color contrast and font choices. We've already talked about sans serif for captions, but there should be strong contrast between the text and the background. Use at least 12-point font size in everything. That's website, downloadable access documents, access maps, all that sort of stuff. Using 12-point font at least is very, very helpful. I would say minimize the use of italics, stay away from all caps because that's very difficult for people to read. Another really, really important one to stress is plain language. So that just means basically no jargon, keeping your sentences short, not using technical terms, traditionally sort of using one thought per sentence is the way to go. And of course, using positive language, affirmative language for people with disability that is inclusive. So yeah, I can't offer an up-to-date list of the preferred language these days, but the big choice we would have to say is between person first and identity first. So we generally go with person first language, so person who is deaf rather than deaf person, or musician who is deaf rather than deaf musician. There is disagreement about that. People with disability have different views on that. Some really do prefer identity first. They see it as part of their creative identity and they want to put that up front. Perhaps they also think that their personhood is inherent and doesn't really need to be drawn attention to. But I would say, as a rule, person first language is the way to go. That will get you into far less trouble.
Good, that's the one we want then. Look, I'm aware of the time. We are getting close to the end, so I might just move on to sort of some final questions.
Yeah.
If we have to choose, what's one message that you'd like attendees to take away from today's conversation?
I would say that there's no such thing as 100% accessible. A lot of people who are at the start of, let's use some reality TV language, at the start of their access journey, are perhaps afraid about making mistakes. They're afraid about starting the process because they think once they open themselves up, the onus is on them to get things 100% right. And that's just not the case. That would be entirely unrealistic as far as an expectation. I am still learning about access. I still make mistakes. The important thing is that you're paying attention, learning from those opportunities, and trying to get better as much as you can. But there's no such thing as 100% access. It's all a work in progress. We're all just doing our best to improve.
True though. All right. So where can people go to learn more or to get involved with accessible arts initiatives?
They can go to the Accessible Arts website and join our mailing list. That is by far the easiest way to get inside track on all of the wonderful events that we offer, and all of the training, because we're adding new specialized courses all the time. We do things like accessibility audits, lots and lots of different services and opportunities that we offer. So yeah, head over to the Accessible Arts site and join that mailing list.
Cool. We might just put a link to that in the email when we send out the recording as well. Just make it simple.
Wonderful.
And I guess lastly, any upcoming projects or events that you'd like to highlight?
Absolutely. We have an Access Ideas and Insights event happening very soon. It's on the topic of disability leadership, and it features wonderful people like a musician, Eliza Hull, musician with disability, who's a dear friend of mine and a wonderful, wonderful artist, and a bunch of other really fantastic people. That's on the 24th of November. There's also, at a more specialized lens, there's accessible marketing workshop that's happening on the 10th of November as well. That's probably relevant to some of the topics we've been talking about tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is any cost associated with that, or people can just sign up via the website?
No, just sign up. Definitely
Great.
the Access Ideas and Insights event is totally free of charge. Yeah, just RSVP, and you can go in person, or you can get a link to the video, which will, of course, also have captions in Auslan as well.
Amazing. All right. Well, thank you so much. There's been so much information here to take in. Learning, as you say, we're all improving, we're all learning. So I will open it up to the floor here. We've got a couple of questions that have come through already, but please, everybody, if you've got anything else that you're curious about, throw those in the Q&A. So the first one is, how can arts organisations make their programs more accessible to audiences with disabilities without making accessibility feel like an afterthought?
Great question. The best thing that you can do is to ask ahead of time about potential access requirements that might arise. And there's a few different ways that you can do that. Obviously, for an arts organization, holding an event, let's say, and you've got guest speakers, ask those speakers at the very first instance, what their accessibility requirements are. They might have an access rider that has requirements, and just be prepared to take that seriously. It doesn't mean because you've asked if they have an access rider that you therefore have to deliver every single thing they ask for. People are going to be sensible about it. It's always going to be a conversation, but getting on the front foot and asking both potential speakers or people performing and audiences that are coming to the event. Same goes for employees. If you're wanting to be an inclusive and accessible organization for employees with disability, make sure questions about access requirements are absolutely front and center. Make sure that it's a policy to ask people, asking everyone, not just people that you perceive to have disability, because the reality is 80% of the 5.5 million people in this country with disability have non-visible disability. So it's a huge, huge number of us. And I think most people are surprised when they ask how many people come back and say, yes, to be honest, it would be great if X could be accounted for. So things like having policies in place to ask for and respond to access requirements, consult with people, consult with people with disability in your community about things that you can do. There will always be fresh ideas and examples that will be gained from consulting people with lived experience. And I would say also get some training for your staff. Go over to the Accessible Arts website and look up one of our wonderful courses. Disability confidence training would be a wonderful place to start. And also, what's the last thing? There was one more thing that I was thinking of. access audits. You can do that as well. We will come out to your, not me, but somebody will come out to your organization, and it can be the building that you work in. If you're thinking about access for that building, it can be a venue that you're holding an event at. The access audit is basically a walkthrough by a person with lived experience who can point out various things that can be changed and made more accessible. So there's a bunch of ideas.
Yeah, loads. Perfect. Okay, now this one is going to I'll just ask it. See how you go. Just throw it out there. It's been asked, why is it important to include conversations about sex, intimacy, and body autonomy in disability arts?
It's important because that's a huge aspect of our experience that has gone underrepresented, I would say, certainly in popular art. So yeah, it's not a subject that I'm an expert on by any means, but I can certainly say I've been at a lot of our events that have involved these sorts of discussions, especially on screen arts. There are aspects of our humanity that have traditionally been ignored or pushed under the rug. And I think it can be very, very liberating for people with disability as performers and audiences to see those aspects put front and center. It can be a wonderful aspect of, I think, one of the wonderful things about dance performances by dancers with disability is a chance to see our bodies doing things that mainstream audiences don't tend to imagine that we can do. And so I would say, again, yeah, it's about representation, which is something that I haven't really spoken of today, but is a huge aspect of the conversation. Getting to a point where, again, representation is the norm. The fact is that 21%, over 21% of the population in this country has disability. I'm just going to keep flinging that number out. And but by the latest count, only 16% of practicing professional musicians have disability. Sorry, 16% of practicing professional artists have disability. And when you get to music, it's only 12%. So these numbers are trending in the wrong direction. And what we need to change that is more representation, more consultation. That's the best way ahead.
Absolutely. Beautifully answered. Thank you. We're going to turn down a totally different topic, back to social media for a moment. Are there any tools or platforms you recommend for making social media more accessible?
There are, yeah. I would say tools, hey, everyone wants a shortcut. I would say one website that's really great for websites, and I include websites as part of social media, is Wave Web AIM, and that is a sort of engine that you can put the website address into, and basically in about 20 seconds it will spit out a review of the accessibility of your web page. It will figure out things like where you've got issues with high or low contrast. It will work out where you have things like missing alt text, missing headers, all sorts of things. So that is a really, really great tool to get a sense of how much work might need to be done for your venue's website or your organization's website. When it comes to specific things like Instagram and Facebook, I don't, off the top of my head, I don't have names. I'm sorry. I do have names, but they're in a file. They're in a set of slides that I haven't given for a while. So, but I can send some of those to you later, and maybe you can put that in the post-event email you send out.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, look, we are right pretty much dead on 6:30 now. If I've got any final questions, now is the time. But otherwise, unless you have any final thoughts to leave us with, Dan, this has been incredible. We truly have ingested so much information tonight, and everything you have said has made sense. and seems very easy to apply, very practical. So, I mean, I'm so grateful for you coming along and sharing all of this with us. It's been wonderful.
My absolute pleasure. Yeah, really a privilege to be able to talk about these sorts of things. I'm glad it made sense. It was a heck of a lot of information to just dump on people, but all of it is set out in very manageable, bite-sized chunks in the various sort of training courses that we offer at Accessible Arts and in the resource manuals. It's not just training. When you sign up for one of those courses, you get a whole bunch of resources, manuals, language guides, templates, all sorts of things. So there are things that can take the load off. But at the same time, there is also really something to stress. There is also a whole bunch of low-hanging fruit out there that can very easily be changed or be plucked and make things more accessible for your audiences.
Absolutely. And we're just getting some thank yous coming through in the Q&A now. People that someone has a thank you so much. It's from Natalie. She has a spinal injury. It affects everything as an event manager. And she says this was incredible. Only one emoji, this one. So, so thank you once again. Thank you to everybody who has joined us here online this evening. We will leave you to enjoy the rest of your evening, despite it not being a Friday, but maybe just get in that vibe anyway. And we'll call it a night. Thank you, Dan. Take care, everybody.